Hey, good day, everybody. Welcome back to Rocky Mountain Readings. I'm feeling a little bit better today, but still not 100%, so bear with me. I'm enjoying this book now. It's starting to get a little more interesting for sure. We've been reading the wonderful book Rabbi Akiva, A Sage of the Talmud by Barry W. Holtz. Shalom, Sheila. Glad to have you with us, as always. Anyways, today we're on Chapter 5, discussing Rabbi Akiva's time among the rabbis. So let's just dive right in. As I have said, we do not know and cannot know the year-by-year history of Akiva's life, but it is clear that the classic sources present him as a person whom his fellow students admired, both as a scholar and as a human being, and his reputation continued to grow as he left his years of preparation and became a rabbinic figure in his own right. The Babylonian Talmud tells a story about a number of rabbis wishing to consult with Rabbi Dosa ben Harkinas, one of the last sages alive from the first generation of rabbinic scholars. The rabbis believe that they are about to overturn one of Dosa's rulings, and before doing so, they want to tell him about their decision and gauge his reaction. 3 rabbis are appointed to meet with him: Rabbi Joshua, Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, and Rabbi Akiva. Dosa ben Harkinas greets each of them as they enter his room. Akiva is the last to enter, and when he comes into the room, Rabbi Dosa exclaims, "Are you Akiva, son of Joseph, whose name is known from one end of the world to the other? Sit down, my son, sit down. May those like you multiply in Israel." That's from Bereisha Yevamot, Leveret Marriages, 16b. To this elderly figure, a contemporary of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Akiva's presence is an extraordinary event, and Dosa gives Akiva his blessing, viewing him as a model for all Jews. Interestingly, a few lines later, the story describes Akiva's encounter in the next room with Rabbi Dosa's contentious and troublemaking younger brother Jonathan. When Jonathan greets Akiva, Jonathan insults him, mimicking his older brother's words, but in a disparaging way. "Are you Akiva, whose name is known from one end of the world to the other? You are blessed indeed to have won fame, even though you have not yet attained the rank of ox herders, not even, replied Rabbi Akiva, that of shepherds." Jonathan mocks Akiva, essentially saying, "Amazing that you have attained such fame, since you are hardly at the level of the lowliest of farm workers." Akiva's response to Jonathan is typical of what we have seen in Akiva before. He is quick to forgive, and even an egregious insult elicits only an expression of Akiva's humility. We can wonder, of course, whether Akiva really views himself... Well, sorry, folks. Not sure who's calling me, but yeah, always soon as... We can wonder, of course, whether Akiva really views himself as so unexceptional, but at the very least, he responds to belligerence with modesty. The story of Akiva and the visit to Rabbi Dosa ben Harkinas is only one example of the status Akiva has attained among the other sages, and that status is embedded in the structure of the story. We have seen this pattern before, and it is repeated in numerous examples in the rabbinic corpus. There is a discussion, or, as in the case, an event, the visit to Dosa, that involves 3 rabbis. 2 opinions are voiced, then Akiva's view is stated last, capping the argument. Akiva often has, as it were, the last word. In the Passover Haggadah, for example, there is a discussion of the 10 plagues brought upon the Egyptians before the Exodus. 3 rabbis, Yossi the Galilean, Eliezer, and Akiva, use their skill of midrashic interpretation to deduce that as terrible as the plagues might have been, the Egyptians were visited by many more plagues as they pursued the Israelites crossing through the Red Sea. The Red Sea, in earlier translations, or the Sea of Reeds. Rabbi Yossi claims that he can interpret the biblical verse, and the magicians of Egypt said to Pharaoh, "It is the finger of God," from Exodus 8:15, by reading it in relationship to the later verse describing the scene at the sea. And Israel saw the great hand which the Lord laid upon the Egyptians. Exodus 14, verse 31. Yossi's inventive perhaps even playful interpretation calculates by midrashic mathematics that if 10 plagues were caused by the finger of God, then the hand of God at the sea would account for 50 plagues. 5 fingers times 10 plagues for each finger equals 50 plagues. Not to be outdone, Rabbi Eliezer takes the discussion even further. He offers a verse from Psalms to show that each plague in Egypt could be multiplied by 4 in terms of its force and horror. Using Rabbi Yossi's mathematical method in a more complex way, Eliezer concludes that at the sea, the hand of God would mean that the Egyptian suffering was equal to 200 plagues, 4 times 50. The discussion concluded with Rabbi Akiva. He follows Eliezer's logic but takes it another step. There really were 5, not 4, dimensions of power in each plague. 5 plagues for each finger, and 5 fingers on the hand of God at the sea. Hence, the Egyptians experienced 250 plagues at the sea, 50 times 5. The logic of the Midrash is anything but clear to a modern sensibility. Indeed, it is hard to know why this Midrash is presented here, aside from its obvious connection to the story of Exodus. But, for our purposes, this text is yet another and quite obvious example of the familiar trope we could call, in the spirit of the text we looked at in the last chapter, Akiva is the Torah. Even in a kind of mathematical competition, Akiva wins. His 250 plagues outdoes the number of his 2 colleagues. This text, in possibly a humorous fashion, once again confirms Akiva's status and importance, but underneath it is something else as well. As we will see, one of the defining characteristics of Akiva, one of his monumental contributions to Jewish religious history, is his dedication to the principle that the interpretation of Torah requires paying careful attention to every detail in the text. That kind of close reading in all its subtlety and all its elements becomes the hallmark of Jewish interpretation for millennia to come. And even here, in a comical, perhaps even parodic way, we see Akiva's interpretive creativity. We find Akiva appearing in some of the most famous and important stories about the sages recounted in rabbinic literature. At times, he is an onlooker, not the central figure in the events described, but even in those cases, he invariably appears in a significant moment or role. We now turn to 2 of the most well-known stories in the rabbinic canon to see Akiva amidst the world of sages. Once again, we must remember that these stories appear in sources composed many years after the setting of the tales. We should not be looking at them as historically accurate accounts of events, but rather as literary representations of crucial issues in the life of rabbinic culture. And for that culture, perhaps no issue is more compelling or troubling than that of the nature of authority. Akiva and his colleagues were deeply concerned with questions such as, who is a leader? Who has power? How diffused is authority? In whose hands does tradition lie? Questions of this sort haunt many of these cornerstone tales in the emerging years of Judaism as it was coming to be defined. Akiva is part of virtually all of them. One of the most elaborate of these tales about the revolt against the leadership of the Patriarch Rabbi Gamaliel II is recounted in the Mishnah and expanded upon in both the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. According to rabbinic lore, Rabbi Gamaliel, as we have seen, was a descendant of the illustrious line of leaders dating back to Hillel the Elder. Rabbinic sources present Gamaliel II as ruling with an iron hand. On 3 occasions, we see him wielding his power over Akiva's teacher, Rabbi Joshua, in disputes in which Joshua took a different position from Gamaliel's. One case, a somewhat obscure matter for us today, dealt with judging whether a blemished animal was fit for use as a sacrifice. Another case focused on the important matter of determining the calendar. In the lunar calendar of Jewish tradition, the new month began with the appearance of the new moon. At a time before the mathematical calculation of the calendar, witnesses were needed to testify that they had actually seen the new moon so that the date could be officially fixed and announced. Since Jewish festivals are located according to their date within a particular month, figuring out the start of any given month had a crucial consequence for the festivals and the fast days of the ritual year. The Mishnah recounts an episode in which Rabbi Joshua and Rabbi Gamaliel disagreed about the reliability of certain witnesses who reported seeing the new moon marking the start of the Hebrew month of Tishri. Tishri is a particularly important month in the Jewish calendar since it includes Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and the harvest festival of Sukkot. Gamaliel declared that Joshua was wrong and, driving his point home, insisted, "I order you to appear before me with your staff and your money on the day which, according to your calculation, should be Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year." And that's from Rosh Hashanah 2, verse 9. Rabbi Goldberg went through this with us in our class. In other words, Gamaliel was making Joshua violate a core stricture forbidding carrying objects and using money on Yom Kippur. Joshua was being made to publicly accept Gamaliel's determination that that day was not Yom Kippur, even though, according to Joshua's reckoning, it was a sacred day. Gamaliel did more than disagree or overrule Joshua. He aimed to humiliate him in public and make him violate his personal principles by disgracing Yom Kippur. At this point, Akiva comes into the story in a small but significant way. Rabbi Akiva went and found him, Joshua, in distress. Akiva said to him, "I can teach you that whatever Rabbi Gamaliel has done is correct. It says in Torah, these are the fixed times, that is, the festivals of the Lord, holy times. You shall proclaim them as sacred times," from Leviticus 23, verse 4. Whether they are proclaimed at their proper time or not at their proper time, I have no other festivals except for these. And that's from Rosh Hashanah 2, verse 9. After Joshua's humiliation by Gamaliel, Akiva seeks out his teacher to offer comfort. The dispute with Gamaliel revolved around the calculation of the calendar, and Akiva's method shows Joshua that it would be possible for Joshua to accept Gamaliel's ruling about the date and to appear on the day that Joshua believed to be Yom Kippur, carrying his staff and his money. Akiva begins by quoting a fairly straightforward verse from Leviticus about the proclamation of festivals. Is there, Akiva asks, an eternal ideal calendar? Good question. Or is the calendar essentially a human construct? The verse in Akiva's reading would emphasize the clause, "You shall proclaim them," from the quoted verse. The emphasis on the word "you." In other words, human beings make the calendar, and human beings proclaim the festivals, even though the calendar is based on events in nature. Big point. The appearance of the new moon, over which humans have no control. The date of Yom Kippur, even if the authorities get it wrong in an absolute astronomical way, misreading the new moon's appearance, it doesn't matter. The case is determined by human agency. And this is what a lot of Noahites that come out of Christianity don't get. There are many things logically deduced from Torah that you can see are determined by human agency, or God has permitted certain things to be determined by human agency. And such may seem arbitrary, but the reality is it's a question of God-given authority. Akiva is saying that by bowing to the will of authority as represented by the patriarch, Joshua would not be compromising his principles and violating Yom Kippur. He would be acknowledging the fact that human courts decide the calendar, and Joshua has simply been outvoted. Very, very, very big point. Hey, Cookie. It is typical of Akiva that he comforts Joshua through the use of text interpretation. Rabbi Joshua is, after all, Akiva's main teacher, and it is perhaps an appropriate insight to try to help Joshua by becoming his teacher at this moment. Akiva thinks that it is precisely this kind of answer that will please Joshua and bring him comfort. Joshua then seeks other advice turning to the elderly Rabbi Dosa ben Harkinas. Dosa also urges Joshua to bow to Gamaliel's ruling. Dosa says to Joshua, if you question this decision, you are undermining all authority of every court in Jewish history. Basically, they would have to go back and rewrite everything. So understand what Hashem has put into their hands. In essence, he asks, do you wish to bring down the entire system? People do this often when they question things that do not need to be questioned. Finally, Joshua relents, perhaps because of the combination of Akiva and Dosa's words. Perhaps he has just grown weary of fighting. But at any rate, the next lines of our Mishnah give us the denouement. He took his staff and his money, and he went to Yavne, to Rabbi Gamaliel, on the day that, according to Joshua's count, should have been Yom Kippur. Clearly, Gamaliel has won. He has established the authority of the court. Oh, forgive me. I didn't take the same cough and cold medicine I did before yesterday's class because I found that it just caused everything to drain. And for the sake of the unity of the communal polity and decisions may have been the right one. But in doing so, he has hurt and humiliated Joshua, and as we will see, the rest of the sages long remember these events. People consider, a cruel ruling from Gamaliel II. These are the events as reported in the Mishnah, a text that was composed around 100 years after the death of Gamaliel. Interestingly, the Babylonian Talmud, a text composed almost 500 years after the Mishnah, expands on the story of Akiva's comforting, deepening our understanding of his empathy. The passage begins with a quotation from the Mishnah we have been reading. Rabbi Akiva went and found Rabbi Joshua in distress, and then continues. Rabbi Akiva said to him, Master, why are you in distress? Rabbi Joshua replied, Akiva, it would be better for me to be on a sick bed for 12 months than that such an injunction should be put upon me. Rabbi Akiva said to him, Will you allow me to tell you something that you yourself have taught me? Rabbi Joshua said to him, Speak. Rabbi Akiva then said to him, The text says you 3 times in 3 separate verses to indicate that you may fix the date of the festivals even if you err inadvertently. You, even if you err deliberately, even you, are misled. Rabbi Joshua replied to him in these words, Akiva, you have comforted me. You have comforted me. That's from Rosh Hashanah 25a. Retellings of the story about Akiva in the Babylonian Talmud tend to deepen or expand his role and status, as we see here in the way the Talmud presents the Mishnah's original story. In this narrative, the text adds an interesting detail. Akiva says to Joshua, Will you allow me to tell you something that you yourself have taught me? We have seen this move before, students telling their teachers or former teachers that they are only repeating something they had previously learned from those very teachers. In the case that I recounted in chapter 4, Akiva used this phrase to defeat Rabbi Eliezer in a dispute about the Passover sacrifice and the rules of the Sabbath. In that story, Akiva's words were either defensive and apologetic or aggressively triumphant, depending on how we read the encounter. But here the words are clearly meant to be for the comfort to the rabbi in distress. By quoting Joshua's teaching back to Joshua, Akiva means to say, you should not feel upset because you yourself have taught us that the determination of the dates is truly in human hands. If Gamaliel's court has determined the date of Yom Kippur differently from your calculation, you can accept his ruling. It's about maintaining the authority of the court. The Mishnah's version of the story, as we have seen, Akiva uses a verse from Leviticus to help comfort Joshua. Here in the Babylonian Talmud's telling, he uses a different interpretive strategy. Instead of honing in on a single verse from Leviticus, he alludes to that verse in Leviticus 23:4, along with two others, Leviticus 22:31, you shall observe my commandments and do them, and Leviticus 23:2, these are my fixed times, the fixed times of the Lord. You shall proclaim them as sacred times. The Hebrew word for them, otam, which appears in all three verses, almost precisely resembles the word for you in the plural, atem. Akiva plays on that resemblance to emphasize the fact that a group of human beings, here alludes to Gamaliel's court, has the right to declare when festivals, or the fixed times in biblical language, can be celebrated. By hearing his own words quoted back to him, Rabbi Joshua is assuaged. You have comforted me, Akiva, you have comforted me. Both Akiva's interpretive creativity and his human compassion are emphasized in this telling of the story. Indeed, the Babylonian Talmud has magnified his role, perhaps because his importance in the rabbinic imagination had grown so significantly by the time of the Talmud's composition. But the extended story of Rabbi Joshua and Rabbi Gamaliel does not end there. There is one more humiliation for Joshua, and finally a reaction by the rabbinic community as a whole. This is the case, once again told in the Mishnah, centers on a question about whether the evening prayer service was mandatory or optional. For traditional Jews today, the evening service, called avrit or ma'avriv, is obligatory, but in ancient times this was still a matter of some debate. Rabbinic tradition linked the daily mandatory prayer service to the sacrifices that had been offered in the temple before its destruction. Sacrifices were offered daily in the morning and in the afternoon, but there was no separate evening sacrifice. With the destruction of the temple, Jews came to view prayers as a substitute for the sacrificial cult. Hence, the question of evening service as a requirement was an open one in the early rabbinic period. Since there had been no evening sacrifice in the temple, was an evening prayer service obligatory or merely a matter of choice? The Babylonian Talmud relates the following incident in connection to this question. A certain student came before Rabbi Joshua and asked him, is the evening prayer compulsory or optional? Rabbi Joshua replied, it is optional. The same student then came before Rabbi Gamaliel and asked him, is the evening prayer compulsory or optional? Now, this is one thing that a student should never do, is go to get two opinions from two different rabbis. In other words, if the one said it's this, then you're supposed to accept it, whether to the left or to the right, whether you agree or you don't agree. But by continuing and asking another rabbi, you're in fact creating the evil error in the dispute. Rabbi Gamaliel replied, it is compulsory. But the student said, didn't Rabbi Joshua tell me that it's optional? Rabbi Gamaliel said, wait till the shield bearers enter the Bet Midrash. When the shield bearers came in, the same questioner stood up and asked, is the evening prayer compulsory or optional? Rabbi Gamaliel replied, it is compulsory. Rabbi Gamaliel said to the sages, is there anyone who disagrees with me about this matter? Rabbi Joshua replied to him, no. Rabbi Gamaliel said to him, but wasn't I told in your name that you said it was optional? He then went on, Joshua, get up on your feet and let them testify against you. Rabbi Joshua stood up and said, if I were alive and he, the student who asked the question, were dead, the living could contradict the dead. There's a big point in here, folks. But now, since he is alive and I am alive, how can the living contradict the living? Rabbi Gamaliel remained sitting and teaching while Rabbi Joshua remained standing, until all the people began to complain and said to Hutzpit, the Turgman, stop, and Hutzpit stopped. Then they then said, how long is Rabbi Gamaliel to go on causing pain to Rabbi Joshua. On Rosh Hashanah last year he caused him pain. He did the same in the matter of the blemished animal being fit for sacrifice. And now he causes pain to him again. Come, let us dispose him. That's from Berkot Blessings 27b. Note Rabban Gamaliel's use of the term shield bearers as an epithet for the sages. Very big point. The idea that the Bet Midrash is a place of conflict and intellectual violence is well expressed by this military metaphor. And it becomes more apt than Gamaliel realizes when his behavior leads to a full-scale revolt by the rest of the rabbis. The pain being caused to Rabbi Joshua through a series of public humiliations orchestrated by Rabban Gamaliel II reaches a breaking point here. The sages remembered the two prior incidences, and now that a third has occurred, they have reached the limit of their tolerance for their leader's authoritarian manner of control. One can wonder as well about Rabbi Joshua's behavior in the story. When Gamaliel asks whether anyone disagrees with this ruling, Joshua lacks the courage of his conviction and will not disagree with Gamaliel. It's interesting that Joshua is the only voice recorded in our story, at least in the way that this tale has come down to us. None of the other rabbis speak up, even in support of Gamaliel. We clearly see the artistry of the storyteller at play here. We might speculate how this might be portrayed in a play or film. Does Rabban Gamaliel look directly at Rabbi Joshua when he speaks? Is there anyone who disagrees with me about this matter? Or perhaps Joshua, worried that his previous opinion on the question will become known to Gamaliel, guiltily blurts out his response, no, before any of the other rabbis has a chance to speak. As a subtle literary piece, the text is morally ambiguous. Gamaliel, knowing quite well how Joshua answered the student's original question about the evening prayer, seems to be cruelly baiting Joshua by asking whether anyone disagrees with him. Joshua seems less than admirable in his saying that if there were not a living witness to testify to what he previously said in answer to the student's question, essentially he could have lied about it. And even the student who asked the original question is an ambiguous figure. Why did he make a point of informing on Rabbi Joshua to Rabban Gamaliel? Was he merely an innocent seeking clarification, or is he somehow stirring up trouble for the purposes of his own? Big question. This is the way a lot of internal group politics get played malevolently and subtly, and some people are just so deviant in the way they go about it, and still try to keep group composure, but force an intent into a group, and it's terrible. But the story is painted in shades of gray, not in clear strokes of black and white. Nonetheless, the moral weight of the narrative leans heavily against Rabban Gamaliel. The sage's outrage about his conduct in regard to Rabbi Joshua gains the sympathy of the reader, and in the way that the narrator tells the tale. We are on the side of the revolt. The story is working hard at balancing two tensions embedded deeply in rabbinic culture. Tensions that will endure throughout later Jewish history. On the one hand, there is a need for reliable, ongoing continuity of decision-making and tradition. On the other hand, there is a deeply held desire to acknowledge and valorize challenges to that tradition. It's about setting precedents, What some scholars have called multivocality, or legal pluralism, of Jewish tradition, meaning many voices can be heard. The deposing of Rabban Gamaliel is not, indeed cannot be, the end of the story. What leadership will come in his place? The Talmud continues. Whom shall we raise up instead? We cannot raise up Rabbi Joshua because he is one of the parties involved. We cannot raise up Rabbi Akiva. Perhaps Rabban Gamaliel will harm him because Akiva has no ancestral merit. Rather, let us raise up Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Yeah, Rabbi Goldberg shared this story with us, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was only 18 years old at the time, who is wise and rich and the 10th in descendant from Ezra. He is wise, so if anyone puts a difficult question to him, he'll be able to answer it. He is rich, in the case he has to pay honor to Caesar, he will be able to do so. He is a 10th in descendant from Ezra, so he has ancestral merit, and Rabbi Gamaliel cannot harm him. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, who the text reports is only 18 years old, 16 in the Jerusalem Talmud's version, at the time of his appointment, is chosen to be Gamaliel's successor. But it is interesting to note that Akiva's name is mentioned first and then rejected because he lacks ancestral merit. The fact that Akiva even appears here as an option suggests that on the basis of a combination of intellectual skill and character, he is the obvious choice to take Rabbi Gamaliel's place. But status in the rabbinic world is based on a number of factors, as we see in the description of Eliezer. Eliezer's wealth and family background are two that are not available to Akiva. Akiva represents a new model of rabbinic hero that was just being born, a meritocracy based upon the person's innate abilities and demonstrated accomplishments. Yeah, it's a question of defining what is leadership. Of course, the world never works quite along those lines, neither in the past nor today. The two pillars of riches and the status of distinguished ancestry never go out of fashion. But this story helps promote an alternative model. A third way that differs from the other two, and Akiva is the finest example in the early formation of Judaism. The story as told in the Babylonian Talmud merely states that Akiva is not chosen because he lacks the proper family background and hence is vulnerable to harm and retribution from the well-connected Rabbi Gamaliel. But the version recorded in the Jerusalem Talmud adds a moving element. They appointed Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah to head the academy, and Rabbi Akiva was sitting, hurt that he had not been chosen. And he said, "It is not that Eliezer knows more Torah than I do, but that he is descended from greater men than I am. Happy is the person whose ancestors have gained merit for him. Happy is the person who has a peg on which to hang." And what was Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah's peg? That he was the 10th generation in descendant from Ezra. Berchot 4:1. From a literary point of view, this version of the story gives us a remarkable moment of insight into Akiva's inner life. He is not a man without ego, as much as we have seen his modesty in other instances. He knows his worth and abilities, but he is bitterly aware of what fate has handed him. He is neither wealth nor a worthy parentage. For modern readers, of course, there is some recompense here. We know that even without becoming the patriarch, the name of Akiva will later far outstrip even the worthy Eliezer. But in the poetic imagination of the Jerusalem Talmud, Akiva has a bitter pill to swallow. And as if to put it an exclamation point on the question of family merit versus talent, as the story continues, Rabbi Eliezer goes on to open up the doors of the Bet Midrash to the many students whom Gamaliel had left outside. Yes, and this is in Pirkei Avos, the second one. Yes, Rabbi Goldberg shared this with us. The day that they removed the guard from the gate and gave permission for students to enter, for Rabbi Gamaliel had issued a proclamation saying, "No student whose inside is not like his outside may enter the Bet Midrash." On that day, many benches were added to accommodate all the new students. Yeah, it comes down to understanding a question of laws of expansion and contraction. Rabbi Gamaliel's position is got so much wisdom, but it's part of contraction. And with the decimation after they had the temple destruction, they needed to be in a state of expansion. And so Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah's position made better sense for that period. And even though Eliezer himself came from a wealthy and socially significant family, he began a process, to use a somewhat anachronistic word, to democratize the academy. Big point. One Talmudic source claims that 400 new benches were added. Another says 700. No matter what the precise number, the Talmud emphasizes a change in the composition of the rabbinic community. The clause, whose inside is not like his outside, is used elsewhere in the Talmud. In Yoma 72b. It's used to indicate a person who puts on a nice show for others that does not conform to his inner true self. A morally deceptive person, in other words. A poser is what I would say. But here, I think it is meant to indicate that the study hall is now open to those without finery, those who lack status. Akiva is already one of those, and so is his teacher, Rabbi Joshua. Indeed, Akiva's strong personal connection to Joshua may in part emanate from the fact that neither of them has great wealth or family reputation. In contrast, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, Akiva's sometime teacher, sometimes nemesis, comes from a land-owning family. As our story continues, we see Rabbi Gamaliel himself begin to change. He worries that he has been withholding Torah from Israel. By restricting membership in the Bet Midrash, and in a sign of true character, forgive me. Okay, and in a sign of true character, Gamaliel continues to participate in the deliberations of the academy, even though he has been deposed from its leadership. It speaks something about his character. As he watches what is going on, he comes to realize his errors and seeks out Rabbi Joshua at Joshua's home to apologize. When Rabbi Gamaliel reached Rabbi Joshua's house, he saw that the walls were black. He said to him, "From the walls of your house it is apparent that you are a smith." The Jerusalem Talmud version has Joshua making needles for his livelihood, an even lowlier job. Rabbi Joshua replied, "Alas, for the generation of which you are the leader, for you do not know the pain of the scholars, how they have to support themselves and sustain themselves." Rabbi Gamaliel said to him, "I apologize, forgive me." Rabbi Joshua paid no attention to him. "Do it," Rabbi Gamaliel said, "out of respect for my fathers." Joshua then forgave him. Then word is sent to the rabbis by a messenger that Rabbi Gamaliel and Rabbi Joshua have become reconciled. But Akiva is suspicious of this news. He doesn't trust the messenger and believes that this may be a ruse perpetrated by a servant of Rabbi Gamaliel's. Rabbi Akiva said, "Lock the doors so that the servants of Rabbi Gamaliel cannot come in and upset the sages." Obviously, emotions are running high, fear and suspicion. Finally, Rabbi Joshua himself comes, knocks on the door of the Bet Midrash, and says that indeed he and Gamaliel have been reconciled. The next day, Joshua and Akiva go together to Gamaliel to announce his reinstatement to leadership. These stories about Rabbi Joshua and Rabbi Gamaliel are concerned both with bowing to the might of leadership and with, in the case of a dispute about the calendar, the power of the rabbis to be the final arbitrator of God's law. So these stories, definitely give us clarity that the rabbis have dealt with these matters from their very beginning. Very important points. All of the narratives in the rabbinic canon that focus on these issues, none has been more extensively explored in recent years than the oven of Aknai, a short tale in the Babylonian Talmud that has profoundly fascinated readers in our time. This story has occasioned exploration by historical and literary scholars, feminist scholars, legal theorists, Jewish theologians, from a wide variety of perspectives, and writers oriented toward the general reader. Here I draw upon a particularly thoroughgoing and careful analysis done by Jeffrey Rubinstein. Rubinstein sees the story as a whole, within its Talmudic context, and in doing so, he emphasizes both its literary elements and its truly tragic dimensions. Just checking Facebook, folks. My own interest here is with the place of the story within the imagined biography of Rabbi Akiva, and therefore I present a somewhat shortened version of the events. The story begins with a debate among the sages about a question related to a topic of great importance in rabbinical culture and one that is rather remote to us today, the matter of ritual purity. According to the Bible and rabbinic law, people and even objects can acquire impurity mainly through contact with death or disease. This question runs so deep, question of ritual purity. If you've ever known anybody who's a perfectionist, or even yourself has been haunted by perfectionism, it's like a chain or dragging around a huge weight that is so burdensome. But the point being that Hashem does not demand perfection or holiness from everyone. The question really comes down to purity and how purity is a balance between perfectionism or utter holiness and impurity, and being relieved of the burden of the impossible standard of achievement is only typified or is best lived out in a life of purity. So the questions around ritual purity and purity in general were very, very tantamount to the rabbis. They don't strive for this ultimate perfection. I mean, they're commanded as Jewish people to be holy as Hashem is holy, which has a different element going beyond the question of purity. But purity is something like the baseline of conduct, and it's important, very important, to know about what purity is and does, and how it's about being legitimate and real. Yeah, people or objects that have become impure cannot have any contact with the temple or other holy places. And in order to dispose of this impurity, a set of rituals was laid out, such as we see described in the book of Leviticus and Deuteronomy in the Bible and expanded upon by the rabbis. But some objects are constructed in such a way that they cannot be purified. There is some similarity here to the rules of keeping kosher followed by the observant Jews today. Excellent, Cookie. Yeah, glad to hear. Yeah, in art, if you were painting, it comes down to development of a style. And if you look at some of the great impressionists, the reality is they developed a style, and think of purity in that light. You developing you. You've got to be the best you can be, and you don't have to compete against the impossible standards of everybody else. As long as you're being better you today than you were yesterday, you're pointing in the right direction. There is some similarity here to the rules of keeping kosher followed by observant Jews today. Some dishes or pots and pans can become unkosher by contact with a non-kosher product or by mixing milk and meat products in the same implement, depending on the materials used and the way the object has been made. It might be possible to make it kosher again through boiling it or subjecting it to high temperatures, for example, but other objects cannot be made kosher again no matter what. It's a question of knowing the difference. In the matter of ritual purity, in most cases it is fairly clear in rabbinic literature which objects can be purified and which cannot. But certain items fall into an ambiguous category. The Talmudic debate in our story begins with one of those confusing objects, a particular oven, known as the oven of Akani. Akni is a proper name, but the story never tells us who Akni might be. The rabbis may be talking about the way that this unknown Akni has constructed his oven, or perhaps this is a brand name. That is, an Akni oven is like a General Electric stove. At any rate, what characterizes the Akni oven, according to the Mishnah, is that it cuts into sections, with sand placed between each section. For the rabbis, this raises a question. According to the rabbinic law, if a clay oven becomes ritually impure, such as through contact with a dead creature, it cannot be purified. But is the Akni oven truly a clay oven? The segmented nature of its construction complicates the question. Then you notice the similar question when electricity came into use. Were the Jewish people allowed to use electricity on Shabbat? And the ruling that came down was it's constituting starting a fire. Electrical spark was considered as starting a fire, which was a prohibition. So, they made perfect sense. Very similar, but, years ago. The Mishnah tells us that Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus ruled that the oven can be purified, and the sages ruled that it cannot. With that background, the Talmud expands upon the Mishnah's terse statement of the debate and fills in the story with considerable detail. Welcome, Nir Ben Ami. On that day, Rabbi Eliezer responded with all the responses in the world, but they, the rabbis, did not accept them from him. Eliezer said to them, "If the law is as I say, let the carob tree prove it." The carob tree uprooted itself from its place and moved 100 cubits. And some say 400 cubits. They said to him, "We don't bring proof from a carob tree." Eliezer said to them, "If the law is as I say, let the stream of water prove it." The water flowed backwards. They said to him, "We don't bring proof from water." Eliezer said to them, "If the law is as I say, let the walls of the Bet Midrash prove it." The walls of the Bet Midrash inclined to fall. Rabbi Joshua rebuked the walls, saying, "When the sages defeat each other in law, what business is it of yours?" It was taught they did not fall because of the honor of Rabbi Joshua, and they did not stand because of the honor of Rabbi Eliezer, and they are still inclining and standing. Rabbi Eliezer said to them, "If the law is as I say, let it be proved from heaven." A heavenly voice went forth and said, "What is it for you with Rabbi Eliezer, since the law is according to him in every place?" Rabbi Joshua stood on his feet and quoted scripture. "It is not in heaven," from Deuteronomy 30, verse 12. This is a big point. What did he mean? Rabbi Jeremiah said the Torah was already given on Mount Sinai, so we do not listen to a heavenly voice. It is written in the Torah, after the majority, one must incline. Later, Rabbi Nathan came upon Elijah and asked him, "What was the Holy One doing at that time?" Elijah said to him, "He laughed and smiled and said, 'My sons have defeated me, my sons have defeated me,'" from Bava Metzia, the middle gate. Writers interested in the theological or legal aspects of the story usually end the retelling here. It makes a good deal of sense. We have seen a debate about the nature of law and authority. As Rubenstein puts it, in dramatic fashion, the rabbis assert not only that the majority has authority over the minority, but that the sages have authority over God in some respects. They have the ability to change the laws of nature in some respects. The sages reject both miracles supporting the minority opinion Forgive me, guys. Still fighting this cold. The sages reject both miracles supporting the minority opinion of Rabbi Eliezer and a heavenly voice stating explicitly that the law follows his opinion with the famous words, "It is not in heaven." That is, the Torah is no longer in God's control in heaven, but has been entrusted to the rabbis on earth to interpret and administer. This is a big point. The story ends with a neat, nice coda. One of the sages bumps into the mysterious Elijah the prophet, still visiting the mundane world after his miraculous ascension to heaven in the Bible. And Elijah informs him that God was laughing, pleased that the rabbis had defeated him. But the story, as told in the Talmud, does not end at that point. It takes a surprising and disturbing turn. At that time, they brought all the objects that Rabbi Eliezer had ruled were pure and burned them and voted and banned him. They said, "Who will go and inform him?" Rabbi Akiva said to them, "I will go, lest a person who is not right for this task informs him, and in doing so destroys the entire world." What did he do? He dressed in black and wrapped himself in black and took off his shoes and sat before him at a distance of 4 cubits, and his eyes streamed with tears. Rabbi Eliezer said to him, "Akiva, why is this day different from the others?" Akiva said to him, "It seems to me that your colleagues are keeping separate from you." Eliezer's eyes too streamed with tears, and he took off his shoes and he sat on the ground. From Bava Metzia 59b. Eliezer has been excommunicated. The other sages will now be keeping separate from him. For Eliezer, indeed, for many of the rabbis, what could be a worse punishment? The life of the rabbis, as we see it described in the Talmud and other classical texts, is a world of community, of conversation, and shared enterprise of Torah study. Elsewhere, the Talmud discusses these bans and likens them to restrictions on lepers and on those in mourning. Indeed, that is what Eliezer will now become. As if struck with a dread disease, he will be a man outside the community and one who is in constant mourning. The theme of death and mourning is obvious here in Akiva's behavior. He comes dressed in black, and his eyes are filled with tears. Sitting at a distance from Eliezer, he symbolizes the separation that Eliezer will now experience from the world of which he has been a part. As Rubenstein points out, the act of burning all the items that Rabbi Eliezer has declared to be pure is shocking. What provoked them to adopt such harsh measures is not completely clear. The sages apparently wish to take revenge at his having defied them in the first place, or attempt to teach him a lesson. In any case, the punishment far outstrips the crime. A nonconformist opinion concerning an unusual type of oven. But when the time comes to inform Eliezer of his excommunication, they are in a quandary. Who will take him the bad news? Interestingly, given Akiva's difficult history with Eliezer, it is Akiva who volunteers for the job. His explanation, "I will go lest a person who is not right for this task informs him, and in doing so destroys the entire world," indicates 2 things. First, Akiva and the other sages, one assumes, is worried about the consequences of what they have done. What will ensue from Eliezer's wrath? Indeed, in the continuation of the story after the section quoted above, terrible things do happen. The world was smitten in 1/3 of wheat, 1/3 of the olives, and 1/2 of the barley. The destruction was so great that on that day, that every place where Rabbi Eliezer cast his eyes immediately was burned. Oh, no, 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 no. They have certain boundaries. Yeah, that's not permissible to them, right? Yeah, they have certain boundaries. But when it comes to, say, the laws of nature, there are, well, what's the word for it? Oh, I remember having to look up the word. Intercalations. They're allowed to look at certain laws of nature and intercalate between motions that actually change the outcome. You got to understand, in their mindset, there was something that was understood as not just natural and supernatural, but there was something that was known as what's it called? Hold on, I think I got it in some notes here. Preternatural. Yeah, preter, preternatural, which was understood by the early rabbis as being a state out of the norm, but within the realm of physics, let's say. So it wouldn't be a normal event, but it would be a preternatural event. They could affect preternatural events, which were kind of hung between natural and supernatural, and many would consider them miraculous. But preternatural possibility, like I said, it's within the laws of physics, but out of the norm. Hope that helps. The destruction was so great on that day that every place where Rabbi Eliezer cast his eyes immediately was burned. Later on, at the conclusion of this tragic tale, the anger of Eliezer leads directly to the death of Rabbi Gamaliel, who is struck down by God in response to Eliezer's prayers. But it is clear that Akiva is worried about something else as well: how to tell such bad news while mitigating the pain of that Eliezer will surely feel. It's a question of what's within their capabilities, and if it comes to your mind that it's within your capability to address, then you're given the responsibility to do such. And so Akiva had this knowledge that Eliezer may feel this way, and in his translation, a person who is not right for this task, I have tried to capture the twofold sense of the Hebrew word hagun used in this text. On the one hand, it implies someone who is worthy, a person of the proper standing, but it also connotes a person who would know how to conduct himself in the best possible way. Yes, Akiva recognizes his own status among the rabbis. He is not without ego, yet at the same time, despite their stormy history, he remains Eliezer's student and wishes to show compassion to his teacher at this terrible hour. More than that, Akiva trusts his own humane qualities, his empathy, and, as we saw in chapter 4, his ability to give rebuke. We see that sensitivity in the very way that Akiva approaches Eliezer here. Akiva is dressed in mourning clothes and removes his shoes, as is the practice of a mourner. As Rubenstein points out, Akiva responds equivocally, it seems to me, and tactfully. Not mentioning the band, but employing the neutral and somewhat ambiguous terminology of separation. Akiva cannot contain his tears, even for Eliezer, who has at times treated him badly. In both the story about Rabbi Joshua's conflict with Rabbi Gamaliel and the story of Rabbi Eliezer's banishment, we see Akiva in the role of comforter. In both cases, Akiva goes out of his way to try to assuage the pain that others are feeling. We see this aspect of Akiva's character in other places as well, often offering comfort through inventive interpretations of biblical verses. But with Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, no textual insight can offer comfort, for no comfort can be had. With Eliezer, Akiva's empathy leads him only to shared mourning and tears. The story of the oven of Achnais highlights Akiva's empathy, and that dimension is appropriate to a reading that fits the larger context of the tale. While it is tempting to focus, as many writers have, on the nature of the legal process and the role of human authority that we see in the middle section of the story, the deeply emotional second part of the story may truly be its main theme. As Rubenstein shows, the story is presented in the Talmud in the midst of extended discussions not about the nature of law, but rather about the ethical sin of wrongdoing through words. The oven of Achnai story seems to be intended as a detailed examination of this moral offense. Wow. Rubenstein brings his discussion to a close with the sudden death of Rabbi Gamaliel, struck down, it appears, by Eliezer's prayer. But in fact, we can see a final conclusion to the story elsewhere, bringing with it an end to the long and difficult drama of Akiva's relationship to his teacher, a sequence of stories that is almost a novella in its length and complexity. Eliezer has been banned according to the Talmud's restrictions. He is not permitted to even say shalom to his friends. He is a pariah in the community. He can take on only menial labor, and most importantly for Rabbi Eliezer, he cannot teach Torah. Whoa. He can only study by himself. The finale of the story is told in the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Sanhedrin, Law Court 68a. Eliezer is lying on his deathbed, and Akiva and the other sages come to see him. We have no inkling of why they have chosen this moment to visit after what appears to be a long time following his excommunication. Perhaps word has come to them that he is approaching the end of his life. Perhaps they feel guilty about what they have done. He looks at them and asks them why they have finally come. To learn Torah, they reply, and quite reasonably he asks them, why have you waited until now? Their answer is both realistic and shocking in its clarity. We didn't have time. His comment back to them shows the anger and the hurt that he has been feeling since they rejected him. He utters a bitter response, indeed a curse. As if speaking to himself, he remarks, I would be surprised if these die a natural death. At that moment, Akiva turns to him and asks, and what about my death? Eliezer replies, your death will be more difficult than theirs. In fact, he is telling the truth about Akiva's future, and his comment recalls the same prediction about Akiva's end that he uttered back when Akiva was his student, as we discussed in the last chapter. Why this special antagonism toward Akiva? After all, it was Akiva who tried so hard to tell him the news about the ban with kindness and sympathy. But perhaps it has become impossible for Eliezer to disassociate Akiva from the events that led to his unhappy fate. Perhaps Akiva's status among the other sages has only magnified him in Eliezer's eyes as the representative or symbol of the community of rabbis that has rejected him. Or perhaps a much older story is at play here, going back to the very beginning of the relationship between these two rabbis. On his deathbed, Eliezer recalls the student who has overturned the mountain that Eliezer helped create, the upstart who has outshone him. Eliezer recalls old jealousies and embarrassments as the young student overtook the teacher and became the hero among his colleagues. All this is too much for Eliezer to bear, and he lashes out with a prophecy that will eventually come to pass. Akiva's death will be particularly cruel. When the Sabbath concludes, Akiva goes out to meet the funeral procession as it moves from Caesarea to Lod, where Eliezer will be buried. Despite all the years of conflict, and despite the angry last words that Eliezer has spoken to him, Akiva is distraught. In grief, the Talmud reports he beat his flesh until the blood flowed down upon the earth. And he quotes the words of shocked despair spoken by the prophet Elijah, and his master Elijah is carried up to heaven. My father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen, 2 Kings 2:12. And with that scene ends the long complex story of their relationship. Wow, interesting. But on that note, that takes us to chapter 6, and I don't want to end at halfway through, so maybe we'll just leave this chapter until tomorrow. I've got lots to do, and appreciate your prayers and support, people. If you're enjoying this, or if you've got suggestions for what we'll do after, please, we're 53% through this. I see the 7 laws is, talking with Cookie there. Yeah, there has to be a Sanhedrin in place, and they have to have the majority of the elected leaders, that can make that decision. But there has to be, they've got rules that prevent them from overturning certain things, but they can never change the Torah. That's for sure. That is unchangeable. All right, so on that note, we're going to leave it at chapter 6 for today, and we will be back tomorrow with more of Rabbi Akiva, sage of the Talmud, and we'll read chapter 6 in the orchard, and if it's a short one, we'll jump through 7 as well. So until that, then, have a wonderful, wonderful day, everybody. Bye for now.